The clink of crystal glasses echoed in the opulent dining room of La Couronne, the city's most exclusive restaurant. Every detail of the establishment screamed sophistication, from the polished mahogany furniture to the gentle glow of vintage chandeliers. Amid this grandeur, Ethan Reed, a young waiter, moved deftly between tables, his black vest impeccably pressed, his white gloves spotless. Yet, as he poured wine and cleared plates, a storm brewed in his mind. Ethan's life was a relentless grind. By day, he worked to exhaustion in the high-stakes world of fine dining, catering to the elite who rarely spared a second glance at him. By night, he grappled with overdue bills and the fear of losing the tiny apartment he shared with his younger sister, Lily, whose medical bills were mounting with every passing day. It was her fragile smile that kept him going, her courage in the face of an unforgiving illness. That evening, an unfamiliar tension gripped the room. Seated at table 7 was Marcus Greer, a reclusive tech billionaire whose fortune was the stuff of legend. The media described him as enigmatic, brilliant, and utterly ruthless, a man who wielded power like a weapon. He was rarely seen in public, making his presence at La Couronne an event that set the entire staff on edge. Ethan approached Marcus's table with professional poise, though his pulse quickened. The man had ordered a simple meal, a perfectly seared steak and a glass of rare Bordeaux. Yet Marcus's piercing gaze seemed to weigh every movement Ethan made, every word he spoke. When the meal ended, Marcus waved Ethan over. From his seat, the billionaire reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a checkbook. Without a word, he scrawled something, tore off the check, and handed it to Ethan. "This is for you," Marcus said, his voice a low rumble. Ethan stared at the slip of paper, disbelief spreading across his face. The sum written on it was staggering, $1 million. "Is this some kind of joke?" Ethan stammered, his voice barely audible over the ambient hum of the restaurant. "Consider it a tip," Marcus said, his expression unreadable. "You've earned it." Ethan blinked, his thoughts racing. The $1 million could change everything: Lily's treatments, their debts, a chance at a future. But why? Why would a man like Marcus Greer, known for his calculated precision, drop such a fortune on a stranger? Marcus's gaze hardened. "Take the money, or leave it. But if you take it, use it wisely. And don't ask questions." Ethan clutched the check as Marcus rose and exited, his bodyguards trailing behind him like shadows. The room seemed to shrink around Ethan as he stood frozen, the piece of paper trembling in his hands. That night, Ethan returned home to their modest apartment, his thoughts a whirlwind of disbelief and possibility. Lily greeted him with her usual warmth, her pale face lighting up as he entered. But Ethan couldn't bring himself to share the news. Something about the encounter with Marcus felt off. The next morning, unable to suppress his curiosity, Ethan decided to deposit the check. To his astonishment, it cleared without issue. He transferred a portion to cover Lily's medical expenses and started paying down their debts. It felt like breathing for the first time in years. But the relief was short-lived. A week later, Ethan noticed a black SUV parked outside his building. The same car trailed him to work the next day. At first, he thought it was a coincidence, but the sense of being watched grew oppressive. One evening, as Ethan unlocked his apartment door, a man in a dark suit appeared behind him. He was lean, sharp-eyed, and exuded a quiet menace. "Mr. Reed," the man said, his voice smooth. "Mr. Greer would like to see you." The words sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. His mind raced with questions. Why now? What did Marcus Greer want from him? The answer, he feared, would be anything but simple. Ethan sat in the back seat of the sleek black SUV, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The interior smelled faintly of leather and cold air. The man who had approached him earlier, Alex, sat beside him, silent and unreadable, his posture unnervingly rigid. The driver didn't say a word either, focusing intently on the road as the city blurred past. "Where are we going?" Ethan finally asked, his voice trembling. To meet Mr. Greer, Alex replied, not bothering to elaborate. The car pulled up to a towering skyscraper downtown, a monolithic structure of glass and steel. Ethan hesitated as the door opened, but Alex's expectant look left him little choice. Together, they ascended to the top floor, stepping into a lavish penthouse that overlooked the entire city. Marcus Greer stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, silhouetted against the evening skyline. The air in the room was thick with tension. Marcus turned slowly as Ethan entered, his piercing eyes seeming to strip away every layer of pretense. Mr. Reed, Marcus said, his voice smooth but cold. I see you've begun using the money. Ethan nodded, his throat dry. I used it for my sister's treatments. I paid some debts. Is that a problem? Marcus's lips twitched into a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. Not at all. I'm glad to see you've made practical choices. But I didn't summon you here to talk about what you've spent. I brought you here to discuss what's next. Ethan frowned. What do you mean, what's next? You said the money was a tip. And it was, Marcus replied, taking a step closer. But surely you didn't think a gesture of that magnitude would come without expectations. The room seemed to close in around Ethan. Expectations? You never said anything about that. Marcus tilted his head. You never asked. Consider this an opportunity, Mr. Reed. The $1 million was my way of testing you. To see if you could handle a taste of power and responsibility. And now, I want to offer you more. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. What kind of offer? Marcus walked to a nearby table and picked up a folder. He handed it to Ethan, who opened it cautiously. Inside were photographs, documents, and what appeared to be a detailed dossier on a man Ethan didn't recognize. That, Marcus said, gesturing to the folder, is someone who owes me a significant debt. I want you to collect. Ethan's stomach churned. Collect? What do you mean? I'm not some enforcer. You don't have to be, Marcus interrupted, his tone icy. All you need to do is deliver a message. Remind him of his obligations. Convince him to do the right thing. Ethan shook his head. Why me? I'm just a waiter. I don't have any experience with this kind of thing. Marcus's smile returned, sharper this time. Precisely. You're invisible, unassuming. People like you can go places others cannot. That makes you valuable. Ethan's pulse raced. Every instinct screamed at him to walk away, to hand back the money and leave this nightmare behind. But then he thought of Lily. The treatments were helping, but they weren't enough. More funds would be needed to keep her afloat, and his own income as a waiter would never be enough. What happens if I say no? Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus's expression darkened. I don't recommend that, Mr. Reed. Turning down this opportunity would be unwise. You see, you've already stepped into my world by accepting that check. There's no going back now. Ethan stared at the folder in his hands, his mind a whirlwind of fear and indecision. Every part of him wanted to reject the man's proposition, but the weight of Lily's needs pressed heavily on his heart. I need time to think, Ethan finally said, his voice trembling. Marcus nodded, surprisingly calm. Take a night. But remember, the clock is ticking. I'll expect your answer by tomorrow. Back at his apartment, Ethan sat in the dim light of the kitchen, the folder open before him. The man in the photos looked ordinary, a middle-aged businessman with graying hair and tired eyes. According to the dossier, he had embezzled millions from one of Marcus's subsidiaries and fled the country, only to return under a false identity. Ethan's phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from Lily. Thank you for everything, Ethan. I couldn't have made it this far without you. Love you. Tears stung his eyes as he stared at the screen. He thought of her fragile smile, her unwavering faith in him. He looked back at the folder, the weight of the decision pressing down on him like a physical force. No matter which path he chose, it felt like a betrayal of his morals or his family. For now, he was trapped in the shadows of Marcus Greer's web, with no clear way out. The dawn broke heavy with unease, casting long shadows across Ethan's tiny apartment. He hadn't slept. The folder remained open on the table, its contents splayed like an accusation. Lily's soft breathing from the next room was the only sound, a fragile reminder of why he even considered stepping into Marcus Greer's dark world. By noon, Ethan found himself back in the black SUV, Alex silently driving him to Marcus's penthouse. The weight in Ethan's chest grew with every mile, a mix of fear and resolve. This time, he wasn't walking in blind. He had a plan, though it was fragile and as desperate as the man who crafted it. Marcus was waiting, as if he'd known Ethan would return. His figure loomed near the massive windows, his back to the door. When Ethan entered, Marcus didn't turn around. "Well?" Marcus asked, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "I've thought about it," Ethan said, his tone steady despite the storm inside him. "I'll do it." Marcus finally turned, his lips curling into a satisfied smirk. "Good. I knew you had the sense to make the right choice." He gestured to Alex, who handed Ethan a slim envelope. "That contains the details of where you'll find our mutual acquaintance. I trust you won't disappoint me." Ethan nodded, tucking the envelope into his pocket. He could feel Marcus's gaze drilling into him as he left the penthouse. The target, Daniel Voss, was holed up in a rundown motel on the outskirts of the city. Ethan arrived as the sun dipped below the horizon, its orange light bathing the crumbling facade in an eerie glow. He parked his car and sat for a moment, his fingers gripping the steering wheel. He could feel the weight of Marcus's expectations pressing down on him. But there was something else in the pit of his stomach, determination. He wasn't just here for Marcus Greer. He was here to take back control of his own life. He knocked on the motel door, his heart pounding. It opened a crack, revealing a wary eye peering through the chain. "Who are you?" the man asked, his voice hoarse. "My name's Ethan," he said. "I'm here to talk." The man hesitated before unchaining the door and letting Ethan in. The room smelled of stale cigarettes and regret, the furniture old and mismatched. "I know why you're here," Daniel said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Marcus sent you, didn't he?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied Daniel, the sagging shoulders, the defeated expression. This wasn't the hardened criminal Marcus had described. This was a man running from something bigger than himself. "I read your file," Ethan said finally. "You stole millions from Marcus." "Why?" Daniel let out a bitter laugh. "Stole? No. I exposed him. Do you know what that man's been doing? Offshore accounts, money laundering, funding operations that would make your skin crawl. I took that money to try and stop him. But no one listens to a guy like me." Ethan's breath caught. The realization hit him like a freight train. He had been pulled into a game far darker than he'd imagined. Marcus wasn't a generous benefactor, he was a predator, using his wealth to manipulate and destroy. "What are you going to do?" Daniel asked, his voice trembling. Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out his phone and dialed. Back in the penthouse, Marcus leaned back in his chair, a glass of scotch in his hand. When his phone rang, he smirked, already anticipating Ethan's report. "Mr. Reed," Marcus said, answering. "I assume the matter is resolved?" "Not quite," Ethan replied. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that Marcus hadn't expected. "Daniel's not the criminal here. You are." Marcus's smirk faltered. "Careful, Mr. Reed. You're walking a very dangerous line." "No, you are," Ethan shot back. "I recorded everything Daniel just told me. All of it. and I've already sent copies to the press and the authorities. By now, they're looking into your accounts, your deals, all of it." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice was ice. "You're making a mistake, Ethan." "No," Ethan said firmly. "The mistake was thinking you could control me. You can keep your blood money. I won't be your pawn." He ended the call and turned to Daniel. "We need to get you somewhere safe." The fallout was swift. Within days, headlines blared the story of Marcus Greer's empire crumbling under allegations of corruption and criminal activity. Ethan returned to work at La Couronne, but his life had changed. Lily's treatments were covered thanks to a fundraiser he started anonymously, and for the first time, he felt free. As he poured wine for a table of diners one evening, he caught himself smiling, a genuine, unburdened smile. He had stood up to a giant and walked away with his integrity intact. And that, Ethan realized, was worth more than $1 million. If you liked it, subscribe to the channel and enjoy these other amazing stories.